This is Dave Smith, legendary creator of classic synths like the Prophet 5, Evolver, Tempest, and more recently one of my personal favorites, the Pro 3. Oh, and he also invented MIDI. And he was still innovating in his field right up until the day that we unfortunately lost Dave last year. But it might surprise you to know, as it did me, that he was most fond of...
I gotta say that after designing synths for 35 years, starting with the Prophet 5 in the late 70s, that this is simply my best synth yet, and well worthy of the Prophet name.
This one's my best one. This one's it. Beats all of them. Last 35 years, this is it. What can I say? 12 voices, analog, digital, a little bit of everything. We took the best of the Prophet 08, the best of the Poly Evolver keyboard, added a bunch of new stuff, and twisted it all together, and we now have the Prophet 12.
So, just 10 years after its release, why doesn't anybody really talk about this synth much anymore? And why am I talking about it a decade later? With the help of a couple friends who have spent a lot more time with it than I have, I'm going to attempt to find out why this synth has seemingly fallen through the cracks. Around the time this synth was released, I had just finished a degree in classical piano, and about the only thing that I really knew about synthesizers was that I wanted to know more about synthesizers. And if there's one thing that I did learn very quickly back in the 2010s, it was that internet consensus seemed to be analog good, digital bad. So despite the Prophet 12 being Dave's new flagship, and potentially also because I couldn't even come close to affording it, I held off and eventually went for the Rev 2 when it came out a couple years later, because analog. And then I promptly forgot about the Prophet 12 for nearly a decade, and I don't think I'm entirely alone there. I mean, so many synthesizers have come out in that span, ironically, some of them returning to a sort of hybrid digital architecture that the Prophet 12 had. And I think that the time in which the Prophet 12 came out, and the analog renaissance that was happening around that time, forced it to be kind of lost in the weeds just a bit. But I also think that the more recent return to digital polysynths and hybrid synthesizers sort of indicates that Dave was yet again a little ahead of the curve. So, all these years later, I happened to run across one for an absolute steal, and I decided to call a friend who was much more familiar with the Prophet 12 than I was. Hey Tony, what's up, man? Yeah, so I just need to pretend like this is the call where I asked you about the Prophet 12, you know? No, I just need footage for the video. This is Nathan. Yeah, I'm looking at a Prophet 12 right now, and I know you have one, and I need you to talk me out of buying it. Jameson Nathan Jones. No, yeah, I'll hold.
Let me read from... Let's all stand right now. I'm going to read from the Prophet 12 manual. Listen to what he says. He says, "The problem is now resolved. The Prophet 12 is my favorite." This is Dave Smith, of course. No question. It sounds different than my other designs, yet it retains the Prophet vibe. There's something magical about the combination of a digital front end followed with analog filters and electronics per voice. The Prophet 12 has a sound, a soul of its own, unlike any other instrument. I love it.
Now I've had the Prophet 12 for several months because I wanted to take the time to live with it and make some actual music with it before making this video. I've heard some mixed reviews on this synth after doing some research on it, and even ended up buying one of its predecessors, the Poly Evolver, to do some comparisons. You can watch a video on that in one of these corners if you'd like. While I could sit here and tell you everything I like about it and everything that I wish it did a little differently, I think it might be a little bit more beneficial and more interesting to talk to someone who is directly involved in its development.
I'm Andrew McGowan. I'm senior product designer at Sequential. I started working for Dave Smith this time at the beginning of 2007 at Dave Smith Instruments, but I had worked with him previously at Sear Systems and at Sequential Circuits back in the old days. So I started working at DSI at the beginning of 2007. The Prophet 08 was in development, and the company grew very slowly in terms of the number of people that worked there. I wore a lot of hats, was extremely busy and worked a lot for the first few years that I worked for DSI. And around the time that, let's see, it would have been the NAMM show when we showed the Polyevolver PE and the Mofo keyboard, I think, I was getting seriously burned out. I was really getting fried. I was just working too much and it was stressful. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, whether I was even going to continue working at DSI. Kind of the 1-2 punch was the development of the Tempest. The development was very long. I was not much involved in it, which meant now instead of being overworked and fried, I went to being extremely bored with like not too much to do for a long time. And I don't do boredom very well. So I started the process of breaking off and forming my own company. I went and got the paperwork for a business license and a fictitious business name statement and all that stuff you do when you're starting a business. And I had 3 products in mind. I had a product plan. I called it a 5-year plan. It probably would have taken more than 5 years. First product I had in mind was sort of an analog signal processor. Second product was a monosynth, and the third product was a hybrid polysynth with digital oscillators and analog filters. So Dave was unaware that I was doing this at the time. I had started prototyping down the road anyway, of prototyping a filter for it based on the 2040, the SSM 2040 design. And one day I was up at the office in San Francisco talking to Dave, and he said, I've kind of been thinking about making a synth, a hybrid synth with digital oscillators and analog filters, polysynth. And so I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting, because that was the path that I was heading down. And we started talking about it. And in the course of talking about it that day, this is all happening on the same day, I started kind of letting slip some of the things that I was thinking about putting in this synth that I was thinking of developing. And we both got kind of excited about it. And we went out to the whiteboard in the engineering area. And within about 15 or 20 minutes, we had probably 90% of kind of the UI and the voice architecture mapped out. That was the only time that ever happened where Dave and I sat down, we totally synced up on an idea, and we just drew it out, and it was largely done. There was, in terms of the product design.
Tony Anderson has been making really beautiful music for a long time, and since the Prophet 12 was his very first hardware synth and he's lived with it for a full decade, I was curious to hear his perspective once he finally returned my many calls.
Oh, I love this one. If I'm honest, when I first experienced the sound of the Prophet 12, I didn't like it. I scrolled through all the preset banks and I just thought, this thing cost $3,000? Like, the sounds to me were so bad. I was used to Omnisphere, which was so textured and deep. And every patch in Omnisphere I would go through was like this deep pad, which I now know would be like a Roland, maybe a Juno 106 or a Jupiter 8. Something hyper low passed and soft with a lot of bottom end and a lot of mid. I was used to sounds of variance and sonic differentiation from the software world. Going to the Prophet 12 was arresting and concerning to me because all of the sounds were very bright, very brassy, very harsh. And they had a little bit of what I now think of as like a bitrate degradation. There seems to be some sort of aliasing. And I didn't know it was a digital synth with an analog filter. All I thought was I just paid $3,000 for this thing. Why does it not sound as good as the software sounds that I have? And honestly, I was disappointed. And I spent about 2 months with it and started running it through effects, software effects. At the time, I'm sure it was a lot of Sound Toys plugins and a lot of delays, a lot of reverbs, and I would just constantly close the filter down on every patch. And probably the first thing I did in those first 2 months was rebuilt all of the factory patches my own way. I reverse engineered and found out, okay, the sound that they put in here, not only do I not like it, I need to find out why I don't like it. And I need to reverse engineer that and go and change it and make it the way I want it and overwrite it. And the Prophet 12 taught me synthesis by reverse engineering the presets that were on it. And I went from, I don't like these, to this is now going to be in every single song that I write in some way. And to this day, that's the commitment I have. The Prophet 12 has to be in every song that has a synthesizer. And really, I've written probably 4 albums with it. And my favorite song I did recently with it was on my last album. It's a little song called Loon. And all I did was run the Prophet 12 through a delay. And that's pretty much the entire song. It's just these very simple chords that have a slightly slow attack on them. And I just let the delay kind of become a main character. And I bonded with that instrument in that process of learning it, because I went from, well, I threw the box away so I can't ship it back, to I never want to let this thing go, and it's my main instrument. In fact, I didn't buy another synthesizer for 7 years. It was just me and the Prophet 12 for 7 straight years.
When I first heard that the Prophet 12 was digital, I kind of falsely assumed that it was just trying to be some sort of virtual analog. We've certainly seen a number of those released in the last few years. But once I started learning more about FM and wavetables, it became apparent the capabilities that this synth actually had. It was never supposed to be an analog clone.
There's been a lot of talk about digital oscillators, analog oscillators, Can you clear that up for us?
It's really simple. We don't take sides. We do what we think sounds the best and makes the most interesting instrument. In this case, for the Prophet 12, the things we wanted to do with the oscillators, you just can't do with analog. It's not up to the task. It's not precise enough. If you want voice-to-voice accuracy doing FM, you can't. It doesn't work. There's just too many limitations. So we don't care. We went with digital. And there's so many more things we could do in the Prophet 12 because of that. It's great. But where analog counts, specifically to filters, they're analog. So, we kind of, there's no one right way to do it.
There was still a very vocal faction who was wanting Dave to make a new Prophet 5, or, something that at least sounded like a Prophet 5. There was pushback on the Prophet 8 because it didn't sound like a Prophet 5. And there was pushback on the Prophet 12 because it didn't sound like a Prophet 5. They both had Prophet in the name. Going back to the old days, I don't really associate the name Prophet with just the Prophet 5 or the Prophet 10. We had Prophet 3000, the Prophet 2002, the Prophet VS, hybrid digital analog synthesizers. So I don't quite make that connection necessarily that a Prophet sounds like a Prophet 5, but there clearly is a segment of the synthesizer buying public who does make that connection.
Sure.
And so there was definitely some pushback.
Yeah, I think kind of similar to an artist, if you have like a hit song, it's like everybody wants that over and over, right? So
Right.
I think when you try to get outside of the box, if you've had such an incredible success and such a legendary creation as the Prophet 5, it's understandable, but I could see from the aspect of being an innovator how it could be a little probably frustrating.
Yeah, and Dave at that point had no interest in remaking a Prophet 5. In fact, that's how I ended up being sort of the lead product designer on the Prophet 6. Was Dave said, you know what it should do. And I did. I'd had at that point 35 years or something to think about what the next version of a Prophet 5 might look like or what it might do. Yeah, he was not terribly interested. And he kind of knew that because we got the Sequential brand name back, that it made sense to do something Prophet 5 like. So from that standpoint, he felt like it was something that was necessary to do, but he still wasn't terribly interested in remaking a Prophet 5.
It was released in an era before the analog renaissance was really back in full swing, right? And so there wasn't a critical part of my brain that was comparing the Prophet 12 to anything. Nowadays, when I get a synth, like when I got the OBX8, I was comparing it to the vintage OBX-A I had rented the year before, and I was critical and analytical about it, and it robbed the joy for me of just enjoying the OBX8. I was comparing it right out of the gate to its predecessor. And I did that with the Juno 106 and the Juno 60 when I bought those, right? Are they as good as the plugin? Is the plugin better? Did I just waste money? And every step of the way, since I've been buying synths after the Prophet 12, I've been comparing. But with the Prophet 12, there was no comparison at all. And I just got to enjoy it. That's it. And there were no forums or YouTube channels yet where people were slamming pieces of gear. It was just Dave's video. That was it. That's the only reference point I had for that instrument. That was it. And that purity is missing now for me when I buy an instrument, right? Rarely do I just unbox it, set it up, and start making music with it for years. Usually it's like, well, maybe I've got to justify the cost of this instrument, right? By like making something worthwhile with it. And so it puts this poor little instrument in this position of having to work for me and earn its keep in my studio, opposed to me just learning it and enjoying all of its little quirks and features.
To me, one of the Prophet 12's most unique features is its character section, a collection of almost additive effects that allow you to shape, bit reduce, drive, and generally mangle the sound of the oscillators before it hits the filters, where, of course, you can then shape it to your heart's content.
The character section actually came from the synth that I was thinking of making. And at that point, it had 5 loosely defined parameters. And I gave them the names Earth and Air, and then Hair was one of them, which ended up with, that became Drive, sort of that slang for, like a tube overdrive or something like that, put some hair on it. Bit Crush. I don't recall that I called it Decimation initially. I think that actually came from somebody else, but essentially Decimation. So kind of the general idea of what ended up there, but just in very undefined terms as to what those things were.
Andrew and Dave together for this synth, they gave us an effects section that is not in any modern instruments. It's not on the Pro 3. I like it because of its quirks. And my favorite thing is when I low pass it all the way, I hear the aliasing and the bit reduction that reminds me of the Tron Legacy soundtrack, which to me is the best score of all time. Like there is no second for me. It's the perfect merger of the orchestral and the electronic to me. I love it. I like that you can hear the aliasing. So you have the really soft pad, and then it's almost like this room noise in a way. Like the Prophet 12's natural room ambiance is a the thing's like angry at you. It's hissing.
It's funny, I talked to Andrew about this, the character section, which you can kind of dial that up even more. So it's like you can emphasize those things and bit reduce it even more. I got the polyevolver. I mean, I've told you that in the past. I got the polyevolver after I got the Prophet 12 because it was kind of intriguing to me, but they sounded incredibly different. It's almost like an additive synth in that character section because you can kind of dial those things up. The polyevolver, again, also has the decimate, but it's at the end of the chain after the filters. Putting everything before the filters on the Prophet 12, perfect. Despite it drawing clear inspiration from the polyevolver in its layout and functionality, I found that the two synths sound very different. The polyevolver can quickly take me places I didn't expect when I sat down with it to make a patch. And since it has all the wavetables from the Prophet VS, it has a delightfully trashy quality and lots of buzz in the top end. The Prophet 12, on the other hand, seems to play a bit nicer with others. And while all of those FM capabilities, the character section, analog filters, and distortion and tune feedback can lead to some really experimental and harsh sounds, it tends to layer really well.
Well, yeah, and it makes sense to kind of draw parallels between those two instruments because I think they do exist. 4 oscillators has Curtis filters, it's got the tuned feedback for digital oscillators in this case, instead of the 2 analog and 2 wavetable, but of advancement of DSP and the digital side of things, or things maybe being more polite. Some of that is probably the involvement of Bob Coover, who did the oscillators. And he did the effects in the character section as well. So that would probably have some impact on the digital side of things because he's very experienced and able in that particular area. One
thing I noticed with the polyevolver is it can really get away from you very quickly when you start to introduce the FM and even. Of course, I think all the wavetables in there are from the VS. Is that correct in the polyevolver?
That is correct.
Okay. They seem to have a bit more brilliance, or maybe it's just that they're a bit more trashy in the digital waves. And so that seems to create a lot more fizz in the high end than the Prophet 12 is able to produce. In terms of the physicality of this synth and the interaction with it, I think it's one of my favorite looking synthesizers of all time, and may very well have the best user interface that I've ever laid my hands on. Oddly enough, for a synth that's a decade old now, it seems like the Prophet 12 is sort of the pinnacle or apex of Sequential's UI design. It can go incredibly deep, but unlike its older sibling, the polyevolver, it's incredibly intuitive, and quickly you can get to some very interesting places.
In terms of the actual physical design, mechanical design, graphic design, we were looking to do something a little more modern looking. So that's why it's got the integrated mod wheel box instead of having a separate box like on the Prophet 6 or the Pro 3 or something like that. New switches and custom lighted switch caps, and it was the first synth that the 2-shot Prophet style knobs showed up on.
Yeah, the screen too was another thing that jumped out at me. It's like very similar to the Pro 3 screen, even which is much more modern.
It's the same OLED, and that actually came from Tempest. That was the first product that had that display in it.
Maybe it's the user interface too. There's no menu diving that I really do.
I think it may be one of the best UIs that I've experienced. Like the ability, and I don't remember my Rev 2 being able to do this, but like everything is in 4s, and just being able to like hold down an LFO button and all 4 LFOs light up, and then you have on the panel control over every parameter for every LFO at once. It's like
Yes.
that's how they should all be.
Because you think you'd get lost in the Prophet 12, but it's actually freakishly simple. It's very simple. Like,
Yeah, well, it is, but it isn't. Like the oscillators, there's so much you can do with it. And when you get into FM, like FM can get absolutely insane, and it can do exponential FM, and then later they added linear FM, which makes it a little bit more musical.
The Prophet 12 has a new update where we now do linear FM, which is the classic FM that John invented back then in the 60s, that was later implemented first in the DX7, a very famous synthesizer, in the early 80s. So what do you think? It's a little different here because we're going through analog filters, which is kind of a cool little treat on top of the FM.
But it's a nice kind of historical reference, and I think relates to a lot to how we hear music because it's so close to how the vocal track works. And so that's very powerful combination of technologies and ideas, right?
Yeah. It's kind of, well, it's funny because analog synthesis is old, but it's new and being revived. Yes. FM synthesis at this point is old, though back then it was so brand new that it took everybody by surprise. So it's kind of fun combining the two and making it something new.
Immediately, like no matter how crazy the sounds get, as soon as I grab that analog filter, just kind of dial things back, it immediately almost becomes like something I could use. So why are many people selling off this synthesizer, often at heavily discounted prices? Why did I forget about it, despite it being one of those synths that caught my eye all those years ago? My personal theory is that Dave was once again ahead of his time.
this sounds controversial. If the Prophet 12 came out today, I don't know that anyone would buy it. The first thing they do is they'd complain about the price. They would complain about it. They would say it doesn't have enough features, which is bizarre because the Prophet 12 is overloaded with features, in my opinion. Then they would say, well, but it's not fully analog, and if I'm going to pay that amount, I need it to be fully analog. Somehow, though, 10 years ago, I picked this up without even knowing a single thing about it. And I use it in every song. So the convergence of how far we've come in 10 years, the amount that people expect for the dollar amount they're paying is 100-fold. To me, I reap the rewards of an instrument that's sitting on my desk over there that, it cost a lot of money, but I spent the last 10 years with it and I love it more. I don't love it less. Sometimes it'll sit over there with its dust cover on, but it's calling my name the entire time. To that end, it's going to stay a staple everywhere. It never goes on my big synth rack with all the other ones. I don't like it getting dust on it, but I like keeping it close.
I do like the Prophet 12 very much, and I wish it was a better known synth. What's the right way to put it? People who have them tend to love them. It was not it was not a failure by any stretch, but it was not a huge seller either.
It was kind of doomed by the time in which it came out, and we touched on this earlier of like the analog revival, and like everything had to be analog. And the funny thing to me, Tony, is lately, within the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years, more recently, you've started to see digital synths kind of come back, right? We've got like the Iridium, we've got the Novation Peak and Summit, and there are all of these digital synthesizers because guess what? Analog can only do a few things. It's people don't understand, I think, because I didn't understand. But when I heard analog was better, it's like, well, what does that even mean? Yes, it can do some things better. Yes, it may have a certain sound that you want, but it also has inherent limitations to it. There are just sounds that you will never get from an analog synth that digital synths can do. If it were released today, there would be pushback on the price, but I don't know if there would be pushback on it not being analog in the same way, because I think Dave was like still ahead of his time a little bit. You know what I mean?
The Hydra synth has sold excessive amounts.
Yeah, there's another one.
It's moved so many units, and it's because it can do everything. For me, when I hear this thing has endless possibilities, I get stressed out. I don't want that. I want limitations. But somehow, the Hydra synth, the Peak, I love that you mentioned the Peak, because to me, I see the Peak as the closest modern sibling to the Prophet 12. The Prophet 12, I think you're right, to push back on that, the sound would line up with what a lot of people are trying to make right now. And it is vastly different. That one of the reasons we like the Pro 3 so much is because that third oscillator gives you the flavor. It's like adding the right amount of salt at the end of a meal or something like that. It's the perfect mixture. And you're right, the OBX8, when I turn it on fully analog, it's very limited. And the OBX8 people will rage and they'll burn trash in the streets like they're doing in Paris right now because the retirement age got raised. They'll do that because they want to protect their $5,000 investment. But the limitation of the OBX8 is enormous. The Prophet 12 can sneak in there. It can fill in all the little cracks, just like you said, with the character settings. That thing plays nice with everything. And I think you are right to say that we're having a digital renaissance. I mean, dude, the prices of the D50 during the pandemic, not sure if you heard about the pandemic, but it was a huge deal. I won't go into it now. Just get on Bing later and type it in, what is pandemic, and you will find out.
Okay,
but
I wrote it down. I'll Google it.
During pandemic, prices of digital synths got out of hand.
If you're looking for something that sounds Prophet 5 like, you'll probably be disappointed because it's not that. It was never intended to be that.
There's a very bell tone, tiny quality to it, like Tiney. Is that a word?
It is now. Like
times.
like Rhodes times.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and it has a glassy sound.
I find that people who invest the time in figuring out what it does well, and it does a number of things well, I think, and it has a unique sound and certainly a usable sound. Yeah, it's something that maybe should be more well known than it actually is, in my opinion, anyway.
Once I forced myself to make like every element of certain tracks with the Prophet 12, I was like, oh, it can do more than I think it can. It's just maybe not what I would go to first for those certain things, you know. It definitely has its strengths, which I think are like evolving textural things, like we've talked about. Also, bell-like tiny, as you have put it, a new word.
That is a word.
Tony Anderson.
You know, I don't think I'll ever get rid of mine. First of all, it was my first synth. And anyone who gets rid of their first synth is also a murderer on the side. They are. Everyone should look around right now, and if you sold your first synth, you're not a safe person. I should say this, you're not a trustworthy no. I will forever keep the Prophet 12 because of the nostalgia effect. I just think this was my first instrument. How can I ever get rid of this? And I know it sounds weird. I don't have kids right now, but if I ever do, I want to have something to give them that has a story behind it, right? And part of that story for me needs to be that Prophet 12 has to be in every song that I write. Even if I don't care if people ever figure that out. That's not important to me. It's important to me to know that instrument, the first one I had, is a part of everything that I do.
I like it. I like it very, very much. It is one of, and you know, there's the just the emotional tie as well, because the development was unique for the reasons I explained before. That, you know, Dave and I kind of sat down and hashed it out in very little time. So that was an experience that's very important to me, and that I will always treasure.
One thing I had to ask Andrew was how Dave felt about the Prophet 12 even in more recent years. Did he still feel as passionately about it being his best synth or one of his absolute favorites, despite having released some incredible synthesizers in the years since it came out?
Dave had pat answer whenever someone would ask him. He had pat answers for lots of things because people asked him the same questions over and over and over again. And when someone would ask him what his favorite synth was, he would always say, the one I'm working on right now, which to some extent was true. He would be neck deep in whatever it was that we were developing. And then by the time we got, even before the product was finished, by the time we got to the end, he was already kind of, I won't say losing interest, but he was kind of moving on to, okay, what are we going to do next? And so to some extent, it was a little bit of a joke as far as the answer goes, but it was kind of true as well. If I asked him, or if a friend asked him, what are your favorite synths among the synths that you've made, he would say the Poly-Evolver keyboard and the Prophet 12.
This is actually one of my favorites still, because it's got all the deep modulation, it's got 4 oscillators, all the envelopes, digital effects built in before the filter.